So let's talk about Entity Framework Core, which is Microsoft's primary data access technology. Now I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity with what Entity Framework is. It's an ORM if you're completely not familiar with it, but I assume that you've used earlier versions of it. So I'm not going to do a complete coverage of Entity Framework Core. But basically what Core is a lightweight, extensible, and cross-platform version of the classic Entity Framework. The full Entity Framework is still available. It's version 6.x and growing from that point. I'm not sure that that branch of Entity Framework is going to get a lot more love from Microsoft or not, but I'm sure we'll see some bug fixes and some minor enhancements because it is pretty widely used. But .NET Core is a new version of Entity Framework Core. The nice thing is that it has the benefits from lessons that Microsoft has learned from years of developing Entity Framework. They have a lot of experience with checking in with customers who have used Entity Framework in various ways and really have put those lessons to use. But it's important to understand that it is a brand new product. Pretty much it has the same relationship. Entity Framework Core has the same relationship to classic Entity Framework as ASP.NET Core has to classic ASP. Okay, so it's new, and most notably, it just from a functional standpoint, you're going to find that it doesn't have nearly the features of the full Entity Framework, the previous classic Entity Framework. And that's partially because it's a new product. Microsoft is really just building it out and enhancing it to get it up to industrial strength. But another part of it is that they really wanted to make something that was modular and lightweight and would work with .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. So a lot of it is going to be familiar, including the top-level APIs. Very familiar. If you've worked with Code First, if you worked with the DB context object, then it's going to look very familiar. But it's important to understand that it's all code first, all the time. That's the strategy within this version of Entity Framework. The nice thing is that you can still reverse engineer a database. And you can keep your code in sync with a database, making changes to your code or making changes to the database. And that all happens through a feature called migrations. So if you're not familiar with migrations from classic Entity Framework, you're probably going to want to get familiar with it. Okay, and like ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework Core is usable today, but it's not quite finished. And it'll be a while before it's completely fleshed out. There are a number of database providers that are available, and there are many differences between Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core, and Microsoft has complete documentation on both of those. But either way, data access using Entity Framework Core is performed using a model, and that's the same sort of thing as with classic Entity Framework. And as I mentioned, you can generate a model from an existing database, hand code a model to match your database, or use Entity Framework migrations to create a database from your model and evolve it as your model changes over time. And that's all handled automatically. It's really a pretty slick system. Migrations, when it first came out, a few versions of the full classic Entity Framework, wasn't fully baked. It was extremely hard to use, but it's really become pretty slick, particularly with some of the command line tools that are now part of .NET Core. Okay, so with that introduction to Entity Framework Core, let's get into the code and build an application that uses it along with View components. Okay, here I am in an empty Visual Studio 2017 environment. So what I'm going to do here is create a brand new project and a brand new View component. And with this, I'm going to pull together a number of ASP.NET Core concepts to explore, a lot that we've covered in this course, including Entity Framework Core. Now, if you've been through any of my LearnNowOnline courses or some of my webinars that I've done over the years, you won't be surprised at all to hear that this is a dog-based application. It's going to let us display the names of sets of our dogs in different places on a website, in different sets of dogs. The UI is kind of lame, but that's irrelevant here. You can fancy it up as much as you want. View components emit HTML. You can style it however you want and so forth. So the sky's the limit as far as that's concerned. Okay, so as I've done several times in this course, I'm going to come here to File, New, Project. I'm going to select the Web Templates and use the ASP.NET Core web application for .NET Core. And I'm going to call this Dog App. To all the cat lovers out there, I apologize, but my thing are dogs. Click on OK, and it goes out in whirs and clicks and clanks and opens up this dialog box. In this case, I want the web application because I want some basic features in there, some views and a home controller, so I don't need to recreate all that stuff on the video. That's something that's pretty straightforward, and it's not really relevant to view components in any framework core here. Okay, I'm not going to use authentication because one of the things I want to do is if I include this with the individual user accounts as I have previously in the course, then that automatically includes the SQL Server provider for Entity Framework. I'm not going to use that provider. I'm going to use a different one, but I want to show you how to implement Entity Framework or to add Entity Framework to an ASP.NET Core application, and specifically Entity Framework Core. Going forward for the rest of this course, if I say just Entity Framework, I mean Entity Framework Core. Okay, so that's everything I need. I'm not going to enable Docker support in this particular case, and now it goes out and creates the project. Okay, there we go. And we get this start page. Lots of interesting links, and you can use them and explore them and so forth, but irrelevant here. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. Okay, so if I come over here to Solution Explorer, see that I have a typical project structure. Again, I don't have quite as full a structure here within Solution Explorer because this is the web application without all of the additional features that are included as part of building this with authentication. So it's a little bit more minimal. It's far from empty. There's still a lot of features. It has jQuery and Bootstrap and various other support tools and so forth. So it's by no means a lightweight application, but it is a good starting point for a sample application like this. But one of the things that's interesting about this is if I go into Dog App, right-click on it, and edit the CS proj file, which is the MS build file, just keep in mind that this is going to change a little bit as Microsoft really fleshes out the switch from project.json to MS build, but this is a first implementation of it. Notice that all of my namespaces here, at least the relevant server ones, are version 1.0.1. I want to update that because I want to use the latest release version as of today, which is 1.1.0. Okay, so now there's a couple different ways of doing that, but it gets into using NuGet. The way I'm going to do now here is that I'm going to come into Tools and the NuGet Package Manager. I could use the Package Manager console. That's a command line sort of an interface for working with NuGet. So it's one of several ways. Typically when I install a new package, that's what I'll use. There's various commands. Essentially it's a shell around PowerShell. Get your head around that. And so you can execute various commands, and there's various Entity Framework commands when you really get into the details of it, particularly when you're working with migrations. And so it's a very nice console to use. But in this case, I want to use the Manage NuGet Packages for Solutions, which is a semi-GUI interface into the NuGet packages. So by default, when I load this up, I get a list of all of the installed packages. So these are all part of the project template that I used to create this project. But as you can see, there's an Updates tab here, and it tells me that there are 14 packages that have updates. So I'll go over to that tab, and it lists them all. And I can select each of those. It'll show what version is available. And for this particular package, it'll tell me that what is installed is version 1.0.0, but there is the latest stable version 1.1.0. And that's what I want to use, but if there's additional ones available, and there are, then I can look at them here. So maybe I do want to use 1.0.1 for a particular thing. Okay, So this is a real handy screen. You can include pre-releases, and that is going to update, and there may be additional ones. I don't remember for this. No, okay, so there's no pre-release packages. But if there are any available for any of these installed packages, then those would be listed as well. And I can select to install the pre-release version of the next version, and I have complete control over that. Okay, but in this case, I don't want the pre-release. I just want released stable versions. And in this case, I want to update all of the packages. So I'll select that there, and I'll click on Update. And it starts the process of downloading all of those new packages and updating them here within the project. I'll get a couple of dialog box prompts. The first is to review the changes, make sure that everything is as I want it. If you really want to go through, you can see in great detail everything that's going to happen. Because it's not just the packages that are listed that I showed you, it's also the dependencies as well. And if you don't want to see this dialog box again, after a few times, you probably don't want to, unless you really want to go through in detail and make sure of everything that is happening behind the scenes. But when you're done doing that, you can click on OK, and it'll continue the process, and then it asks to accept the license. Now, this is kind of important. I think pretty much all the packages that I'm working with here from Microsoft. So there's a specific license that's generally consistent between all of the packages. But you could also have third-party products as well, and there might be a little bit different license. So you want to be careful and review that and make sure that you're complying with the license terms. Once you finish that, you can click on Accept, and then it'll go out and continue to download everything and update the project. Okay, for the most part, the output window will keep you apprised of what's going on. And you can also look at the status bar down below in order to see what exactly is going on. Now in this case it says ready, but I know it's not completed yet because it still says that I have 14 updates. So the process is still going on, so you just kind of need to be patient, maybe go and get some coffee or whatever. Now there are occasionally weird messages like the one that just flashed up there that it says detect package downgrade. And that's kind of weird because I'm upgrading to version 1.1.0, but I'm not sure that it's some sort of intermediate step. So for the most part, unless we get some actual error messages, I'm just going to ignore that. And I'm not sure why we're getting repeated messages that routing is being downgraded, but hopefully eventually it will completely update everything. Okay, so you can see that I no longer have any updates, no packages found that need updates, and it also says that the restore completed in however many seconds it took. Okay, so at this point it's complete, and I'm going to close this window because this window for some reason has a kind of a bad habit of it's almost like it's staying on top amongst all the tabs in Visual Studio. So if you get that, you can just go ahead and close that window there. And now if I come over to Solution Explorer and I right click on the project and look to edit the CS proj file, you can see that all of the packages, the explicit packages that I have here, and it says, okay, so it's changed, but I just opened it, so it should be current, so I'll go ahead and reload it. But you can see all the version numbers are 1.1.0. All right, and one more thing, because I'm a little bit of a paranoid person, I'm going to rebuild the entire solution just to make sure that nothing broke, everything's still working, it all still compiles. All right, so that's a good sign when it actually starts recompiling. And it goes through and it successfully rebuilt everything. Okay, so all is well. We didn't break anything by updating to the latest version of .NET. The output window sometimes has a habit of sticking around too, so I'll minimize that. Okay, so we have a project template in place. All the packages that we've added so far are all up to date. So now we need to start implementing Entity Framework within the application. So that first requires adding Entity Framework. You have to add that package because that's not a standard part of this project. And just to prove that that's the case, I'll go over here to Dependencies, NuGet, and it lists all the packages, and you don't see Microsoft.Entity Framework Core listed there. Okay, so we need to add it to the package. Now in this case, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, I'm going to be using the in-memory database. This is great for sample applications like this, as well as for testing. you don't need a persistent database. That's the biggest benefit. I don't have to worry about keeping it in sync and so forth. So it's in memory. I can write all my code. It's as though I had a persistent database behind it, but it's just using Entity Framework in memory. Okay, so it's a real handy thing for early stages in a development application. And I could foresee that there are some scenarios where it would be handy to use in a real production application, but I suspect those are fairly few and far between, probably fairly esoteric. Okay, so in this case, I could go back into the project manager for Manage NuGet Packages for Solution, but this time I'm going to use the Package Manager console because you're really going to want to get familiar with this. And notice that it's based on PowerShell. It's actually a PowerShell host within Visual Studio, but this gives you an interface into working with packages. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type install -pack, and the full command is install-package. But I want to show you that I can hit the tab key, which I just did, and it'll go out and give me a list of all of the available commands that I can use within this context that start with install-pack. All right, so it takes a few moments to load that, and then I can hit tab and I have the full name of the command. So if you know it's called install something, you can type in install dash and it'll give you a list of the available commands. Okay, and then the package that I need to install is Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And if I was going to use SQL Server, I'd type in SQL Server here, but in this case, I want to use in memory. So it's important to understand that that is one of the providers that is supported by Entity Framework. Okay, and generally you're going to need to use some provider because Entity Framework needs to understand what kind of a database it's working with. In this case, in memory, SQL Server, MySQL, all the various database providers that are available. And there's a number that are available from Microsoft as well as third parties. In fact, MySQL has 3 different big packages. I think there's actually 4, but it's apparently not as widely used. One from Oracle, who owns MySQL, as well as a couple third-party packages as well. And Oracle tends to be a little slow to develop support things like NuGet packages. They eventually get there, but so you may want to consider using a third-party package. And there's a lot of free and open source ones as well. Okay, so I'll go ahead and hit enter. And then it goes out and checks on the dependencies because there's certain things that in-memory package depends upon. And one of them, in fact, is Entity Framework Core that you can see right there that's being installed. Okay, so you can see that took a certain number of seconds. It installed the dependencies, determined the dependencies, downloaded the packages, and now we're all set to go. Okay, so me being paranoid, I'm going to hit save, just make sure that everything is saved. And once again, I'm going to rebuild the solution just to make sure that nothing broke. This is just me being paranoid. And once again, it succeeded, so far I've not broken the application. All right, now the next thing I need to do is start building the Entity Framework objects. And I don't need this anymore, so I can unpin that. I'll go ahead and pin that for the time being. Don't need those anymore, some good housekeeping. All right, so I need to now create the model and the object context. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining those concepts. LearnNowOnline has at least one Entity Framework course that I did about Entity Framework 6, and we talk a lot about the concepts behind Entity Framework. So go check out that course if you need that kind of background. Pretty much everything a lot of the stuff in Entity Framework 6 applies in terms of the programming, but where I work with the GUI Object Designer, Entity Designer, that doesn't apply. So just be aware that some things have changed. But I do talk about the concepts behind Entity Framework within that. Okay, so notice there's no models folder. That's a good convention to use to put all of your models within a models folder. So I'm going to add a folder here. And I'll call it models. And I'll right click on that. and I need to add a class. So I'll add class, ASP.NET Core, and this is going to be the dog class, because this is the core model that I'm going to use with Entity Framework. Now, by the way, one nice thing with later versions of Visual Studio, if I just did this and left off the CS, Visual Studio used to create just a dog file with no extension. But now it sees that I'm using C# and that I want a class, and so when I click on Add there, it's smart enough to know, now don't prove me wrong, Visual Studio. There we go. So it adds the extension. So Visual Studio has gotten a little bit smarter over the years. All right, so I have this dog model. This is a POCO class, a plain old C# object. I'm going to hit Control-KD because I like tabs that are 3 characters wide. I just need to add a few properties. I'm going to add first a property for the dog ID. So, by the way, if you're not familiar with what I just did there, I typed in PROP for property and hit Tab twice, and it gives me this nice template for an automatic property. So if you're going to create a fancier property that has different getters and setters, then that doesn't work quite as well. But this is real nice for simple properties, particularly for a simple model like I'm going to do here. So by default, it's an int. That's what I want for the dog ID. So I can just hit Tab and do dog ID. And so now we have that dog ID. And I'm going to make that, for ID, I like acronyms to be all capitalized. Okay, the next property I need is, I'll hit Tab twice, is a string, and this is going to be called name. All right, and then the last one I need is a Boolean, and I'm going to call this over the bridge. So some of you may know what what that means, but I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to save that model. So as you can see, I just have 3 pieces of information about the dog that I want to save. Okay, now the next thing I need to do is add a dog context. So this is the context object. It's going to inherit from DB context, which is a standard way of doing Entity Framework programming, although even with Entity Framework Core, there's various ways that you can create the object context and a lot of sophistication. In fact, when I reversed engineered that MySQL database that I'm currently working on a project in ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core, I was a little amazed at what that particular MySQL provider reverse engineered for the data context. It had it picked up a lot of features that I designed into the database, including relationships and various constraints and so forth, and pulled them in. And that's going to vary by provider. All right, so I'll right-click on models again because I need to add another class. And I'm going to call this one a dog context. And unfortunately, for some reason, Visual Studio 2017 doesn't remember my last choice. So hopefully that'll be something that Microsoft will fix. But this is going to be called dog context. Nothing magical about the name, but it'll go ahead and add that class. And as usual, open it up within the designer. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is have this inherit from DB context. Now notice that I'm not getting any IntelliSense. It doesn't know what DB context is. So what I can do is hover over it, select here, and it'll give me, generally, if I haven't done something wrong and if Entity Framework is actually part of the package, it'll give me this option to add the using statement of using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, because this class is implemented within that namespace. Okay, so now this DB context is, it's not real complex, but what I'm going to do is cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to come in and copy the code here rather than type it all out. This is a little bit tricky, so I want to make sure that I don't mess anything up. Okay, so I'll pass that in, and I will be doing some typing and talking about stuff, but this is a fairly simple class that I just want to make sure I got right first time out. Okay, so what this is doing is there's a constructor here, dog context, and I'm passing in this dog context and allowing different options to be passed in. And this is just, I don't need to do anything with the options here within the class, but I do need to apply those options to the base class, and so I'm calling the base there. Okay. All right, and then in this case, very, very simple entity framework core model. All I have is a collection of dogs. This is, in any full-fledged application, you're going to have probably multiple collections, a number of different models that are involved in this class, and you can get very sophisticated and write hundreds, if not thousands, of lines of code here within your DB context, which for very complex databases, very sophisticated scenarios where you have complex relationships, you need to do querying, you want to simplify your query, so you want to take it as the full benefit of everything that is within the database. You may have a lot of code that is defining this class. Okay, but here, this is all I need. It's very simple. The main thing that's going on here is I have that collection property of dogs, so I can access those dogs. Okay, save early and save often. And now what I need to do is, because I have added Entity Framework, add the packages to the application, I've created my model in my DB context, my dog context. Now I need to add the Entity Framework service to the application. And as I've talked about extensively in this course, that has to happen here within setup.cs. So what's interesting here is that because I didn't create the application with authentication, it didn't pull in Entity Framework. And so it didn't automatically configure the startup code, specifically the configure services method, to use the Entity Framework. So I have to add it manually. Okay, so I'm going to add it before MVC. I'll do another Control-K-D to get everything in line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this iService collection that's being injected into this method. So I'm going to specify services and add DB context. And this is a dog context that I want to use. Okay, so notice that I'm not getting dog context. And the reason for that is that I haven't added a using statement. So I'll go ahead and add it like that. I can once again hover over it, and it'll see that I need to use dog app models because it sees that there is a dog context within the project, and it's in the dog app models, so that'll add that using statement. And then I need to specify options, and that's a Lambda expression. And I'm going to use the in-memory database. Okay, so I need to type this correctly. Because as you see, I'm not getting IntelliSense for it. Now, what's really interesting here, and I haven't seen this a lot, and I'm kind of hoping that it's just some early part of Entity Framework Core, not fully being integrated with the tools in Visual Studio, but whatever. But I have the red squiggly, never a good sign. And it says that DB Context Options Builder does not contain a definition for use in memory database, and no extension method use in memory database. Accepting a first argument of type blah can be fine. Are you missing a user directive, and so forth? Well, I don't need any arguments and so forth. But what's going on here is, for some reason, it's not picking up that I need to use the Entity Framework Core namespace. And so I think it may have something to do that this is an extension method, and so something's broken with IntelliSense. But easily fixed. I just come up here, I'll add it to the bottom here, and I need to add use Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Fortunately, it's there. And I'll save the file. And then come down here and notice that that's gone. So that's all I needed to do to remove that problem. So that's kind of a place where IntelliSense and quick actions within Visual Studio. Quick actions is a little light bulb that sometimes when I'm hovering over it appears to the left, other times appears in the left margin. Let me down. So just be aware of that little bit of a kind of an anomaly in the support that Visual Studio has. Okay, so at this point I have now added that. I've wired it up for use, so I can use that Entity Framework dog context within my application. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and build this once again just to make sure that I haven't broken anything, it's finding everything that it needs and so forth. going through, sweating bullets, and it succeeded. Okay, so that's a good sign. I'm not breaking anything too much as I'm going along. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to create a service. And I'm going to use this as a source of dog information. So this is one of many ways of including one way to provide data to a view component. So it's defining a service. So what I'm going to do is ultimately create a view component that displays our dog names. It can display them all, just the current dogs, or those who have left us, which is the gone over the bridge euphemism that if you're a pet owner, it comes from the Rainbow Bridge poem. These dogs are dead. I can't, sugarcoat it or anything like that. But please don't worry. Most of them died of old age after a long and comfortable life here, including those who chose not to be sled dogs. And we've had over the years a few, and we still have a few that just never chose to be sled dogs. And that's okay. We're happy to have them and have them in our lives. So I have happy memories of them all. Anytime I think of them, I miss them, and I'm sad that they're not in my life anymore, but I smile at the memories. So please don't take this as a negative and get down. This is I celebrate all of the dogs who have been in my life. Okay, so enough of that sentimental stuff. So I'm going to come back over here to Solution Explorer. And typical convention is to put services in a separate folder. So I'm going to come down here and add new folder. And I'll call this services. But like models, like view components that we'll talk about later, there's nothing magic about these folders. Sometimes there are magic folders. Controllers and views need to be in specific places, unless you're willing to write all the code to get around that and use them. But nothing magical here, as long as it's in a location where Visual Studio knows to find it and compiles the C# code into the application. Okay, so within that folder, I'm going to right-click here, add. I'm going to add a new item. And this time I want to add an interface. And I'm going to call this the iDog service. And hit enter. All right, so that defines the dog service for us. And in this case, I'll do Control D again, get everything lined up. I just need a single line here because it's going to implement anything that implements this interface needs to implement a single method. It's going to be an asynchronous method, so it's going to use a task, and it's going to be a list of dogs, a generic list of dogs. Okay. And notice that I'm not getting dogs, so we'll have to add that namespace as well. So it's going to return a list of dogs. By the way, if you're not familiar with asynchronous programming, for ASP.NET Core, you're really going to need to learn about it. Basically, anytime you're using an asynchronous service, you're going to need to return a task of something. In this case, it's a collection of dogs, but it could be a single object as well. It's not a real heavy topic. It's a very sophisticated, complex topic, but for the most part, you can sort of remain not ignorant, but you can remain not an expert at it and still get along as an ASP.NET Core developer, but you're really going to need to learn about it. So just keep that in the back of your head as you're looking to develop more sophisticated any kind of .NET Core application. Okay, so the name of the method is going to be getDogs, because I'm going to allow getting dogs. And then there'll be an optional parameter. So I'll use an optional Boolean there, or a nullable Boolean is the correct term. And I'm going to call this over the bridge. So this is going to indicate whether or not I want to include dogs that have gone over the bridge, that have left us, or not. And as you're going to see that if I don't pass in a parameter, if it's null, then I'm just going to return a list of all of the dogs. Okay. So that's the definition there. Once again, I have the dog item there. I can use a quick action if the little light bulb jumps around and add dog app models. And of course, I can add that manually. Typically, I know I'm going to use the objects within the models folder. I'll just go ahead and add that there. And keep in mind that the namespace is the application name and then the folder. because by default, when you create a new folder within Visual Studio, all the code that you add to that is added to the namespace of that folder. And that's usually a good thing. But if I wanted to, I could come in here in Models, change the namespaces to use Services. They could still be in the Models folder, but they're going to use the Services namespace. I don't know why I would do that, but you could do that. Okay. All right, so that's the interface that we're going to use to implement the application. Next thing I need to do is add a dog service class. And this is where I'm using a little bit of a level of sophistication that isn't really necessary for this simple application, but in a real application, real service, we have multiple services, multiple instances of services, and so forth. You need to define the interface and the concrete class. And as you're going to see, what I'm in the middle of is defining a new service for this ASP.NET Core application, like we've been talking about throughout this entire course, where you add services and configure them within Startup. This is a service that you can use in the application, and you can enroll it in dependency injection. Okay, in this case, I need a class, and I'll call this the dog service. I need to enter, and it'll go ahead and create that class. And now this is a complex class, so I'm going to come over here and just copy all of this code en masse. But I will explain all of this code. The longest section of it is just seeding the object with data. Okay, so I'll come over in here and insert all that code. I'll go ahead and save it and go home, and I'll do Control D. And it'll take a moment for, whoops, oh, copied a little bit too much there. Class dog service, I'll go ahead and keep that. Well, actually, I need to, yeah, I copied the entire class from my sample code. Whoops. Well, that's kind of weird. I don't want to format the selection. Did Control C. Visual Studio is not responding. Okay, well, hopefully it didn't do anything funky. Okay, yeah, got it all. Okay, and then I'll also get rid of all of this because it's redundant. And there we go. Okay, it's not picking up iDog service because I haven't saved it yet. As soon as I do that, the compiler should kick in, and that should go away because it does not implement get dog. Oh, I have a typo in my code here. So get dogs, get dog. Yes, it does. Did I misspell it here? Oh, I did. I want this to be get dogs. Okay, knew I had something wrong someplace. Okay, so eventually the compiler now should get caught up. Okay, and so the red squiggly is gone. I just had the name of the method in my interface incorrect. Just left off the S. Can't read my own notes. Okay, so let's talk about this code. So first of all, it's implementing iDog service, which means that we have to implement this getDogs method. And here is where it's using dependency injection. Now keep in mind, I went over to Startup and I added the dog context using the addDB context method within configure services. And so I can do things like this where I can inject that object into the constructor for this service. And keep in mind that back over here where I defined that method over here, where am I? Right there. Okay, this is where it defines the dog context, and then internally the addDB context, that's one of those complex methods that adds a service to the application. So it takes care of enrolling it in dependency injection. I don't have to add a transient or scoped or whatever, because addDB context understands Entity Framework and it knows exactly what to do, which of those lifetimes it needs to use. Okay, so I have a private variable, private field, that I'm going to save a reference to that context object, and I assign that there. And then I'm also going to check to see if the count of dogs is 0. That means that the data context has not been initialized, and I'm going to call the seed data method. All right, there's a lot of different ways to do this, and in fact the earlier view components sample that I showed you did it quite differently. But this is another way of doing it. I just have a method here. I new up a list of dogs, and then I instantiate all of the dogs. And I think there's 41. So there's been 41 dogs that have passed through Carol's and my life while we've been together anyway. Both of us have had dogs earlier in our lives, but and some are still with us and some have left us. But that's a complete list of all our sometimes creative names, including Gummy Bear. Long story behind that name. Okay, so I knew up a bunch of objects. I add it to that list of dogs. And then I can use the add range method that is provided by the dbset method of the Entity Framework context. Add that list of dogs in one fell swoop, and then save changes async. And now it's part of the database. And this only has to happen once, anytime that it sees that there are no dogs currently in the application. And again, if you want to see a different way of doing this, look back at the other sample view components application that I showed you. Okay, so then all that's left is to implement the getDogs method. It's a nullable Boolean because I may not pass that, and it's over the bridge. And then I go in. I don't want any tracking on this. This, as it turns out, is important because when I first created this application, I didn't use as no tracking. Even though I'm not updating the data in this application, what as no tracking does is it tells Entity Framework, don't worry about tracking changes to the data because I don't care about those changes. In this particular case, I don't care about it because I'm not making any changes to it, other than the initial seeding of that data. But I didn't include this initially. Got all the code, everything was working, was compiling great, and I would run it, and it would successfully execute the code for the first view component, but then it would choke on the second view component. And I forget exactly what the error message was, but it said something essentially that you already have this data being tracked by another instance of the object. And so I was getting, because I needed multiple data contexts or dog contexts, there was a problem with that. But as no tracking solves that. All right, and then I need as queryable because I'm separating out the where clause here, because I only want to use the where method if over the bridge isn't null. If it's null, if I don't pass in a value there, then I want to include all of the dogs. If I don't, then I want to filter them. And in this case, I want to match the value true or false that I pass into the method. So, kind of a nice little technique for breaking up the overall query that Entity Framework is going to make to the database. Okay, so this needs to be async, so I have an await there, and then I'm going to order by the name, and I'm going to return a list. Okay, so that's the dog service that I need to implement. So at this point, we have an application. It has the Entity Framework model. It has the startup method fully wired. Hopefully I didn't miss anything there. And then it has a service that's going to provide data to the view component that we're going to build.